Hello, everybody. This is Dan Libenson, and I'm back here again with Denise Handlarski for this week's episode of Daring Judaism. Denise, how are you doing?
I'm okay. It's been a tough week in the world, but I'm hanging in. How are you?
I'm okay. It has been a tough week in the world, and tough for all of us to sort of figure out what the right way to be is. It's particularly difficult, I think, because in some ways, the COVID situation that we've been living with difficultly for, is that a word, for the last 3 months, is at odds with what we might normally do in a time like this in terms of what's happening in terms of race in America. I'm not sure exactly what's happening in Canada. Would love to understand better, but like if it wasn't COVID and if we didn't have both in our home and outside of our home vulnerable health situations, and we would be on the barricades, and it's hard to know what to do in this time.
Hmm.
Where are you at?
Yeah, I mean, definitely. I used to join so many demonstrations and marches, and I didn't go. There was a pretty big one in Canada. So interestingly, timing wise, and I'm not surprised this news doesn't reach the U.S. with everything going on there, but there was, I believe, I could be wrong. I believe the day after the Floyd murder in the U.S., there was a Black woman here in Toronto, and her family called 911 for support. I don't know all the details about it, and many of the details are not clear yet, but she was having some kind of mental health crisis, or there was some problem. And five police officers entered her apartment, and then she ended up being thrown or falling off the balcony. It's not clear, but her family has made a statement saying they believe if the police hadn't gone in, then she would still be alive. So there were large Black Lives Matter demonstrations here in Toronto as well. And it was the first time that I wasn't part of them. It's partly related to COVID. I do think some people try to be careful about distancing, but it's imperfect. But it's also just about the realities that, like, we can't so easily get somebody to come watch our kids so we can go be part of that, as normally that would be a little bit more possible. So it was strange to feel like I was sitting on the sidelines, but I'm also aware that demonstrations are just one way. Um, and I really do think that part of what we can do now um, is to just make sure we're, for sure donating to relevant causes. I've been doing a lot of that, but also really just everywhere I see racism or white silence or denial or whatever it is. Um, normally I have a policy of don't feed the trolls, but I'm engaging the
Mm,
trolls
I've
now
noticed
because I
that.
think,
Yeah.
yeah, this is a time I think to do that,
Hmm.
um, and maybe we should always do that. I don't know. And for me, it's never about the person themselves. I think people often
Right.
like to say things that are inflammatory. That's about them. They have their own stuff going on, but it's for the people watching. It's for the people of color watching who are sick of fighting those battles alone.
Right.
And it's for all the other people watching who may not know that much about these issues. And so those of us who do know, I'm not like a leading expert, but I do teach about anti-racism, and I've taught a whole graduate course on race, ethnicity, and education. I've certainly read a lot, and I want to amplify the voices of Black folks that I've read and who are really clear about how this is in North America a white supremacist society. They're right, and we're part of it.
Yeah. And on our another show that I do with B'nai Lappi yesterday, we did it's called the Oral Talmud, and we studied this text from the Talmud that actually we had independently shared on Facebook, Jewish Live and Lex Rofberg separately, and then Svara shared this text, and it basically says the bottom line is that if you have the capacity to protest something and you don't protest it, then you kind of take on the sin of what was being protested against. And it's a powerful text. It's actually a very subtle text. There's a lot in there, and I was glad to have spent an hour studying it. That felt sort of like an appropriate thing to do, and I think that there's more to unpack today out of not that specific text, but just the idea of, as we've talked about in different shows, like, well, what's the point of Jewish texts when we don't believe that they're from God? So it's a mixed bag, of course, and there's plenty of uh, texts that kind of say you should protest, and there's plenty of texts that are racist and sexist, as one of them we'll discuss today potentially, or
Right.
maybe not. It'll be an interesting conversation, but I mean, we'll discuss it. It may or may not be sexist. The Well, I have a take. But
I can't wait to hear how it's not sexist.
yeah, well,
I feel like we'll
it is
disagree.
and it isn't, but there's a potentially two saving graces to it. But we'll
All
get
right,
into that.
we will.
But there's another piece. Like, I've been struggling what I should do. There, in other words, there's I made right. I also I was it was sort of a fortunate turn of events that Donald Trump sent us a large check the other day. Like, it's the stimulus check, and it's Donald Trump insisted that he should be able to sign it or to put his name on it, so it was actually held up from doing the good for the people. Anyway, turned out that because it was held up, it arrived just at the same time as I found a variety of interesting places to donate it to. So
Right,
that
good.
was convenient. But but more broadly, it's kind of like and this comes out of that text, that Talmud text. What does it mean to protest? The word that they use in the Talmud doesn't mean protest like to go out on the barricades. It could mean that, but it doesn't necessarily mean that. It basically means to object, and to
Right,
object orally. And actually, the initial case that's given is the case of a woman who maybe it's not a woman. Why do I think it's a woman? Anyway, it's a person. It's the neighbor of Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah, who sent her cow out on Shabbat in a way that you're not supposed to. And the Talmud ends up calling it Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah's cow. And they're kind of, and it turns out Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah was like a very rich man. He had many cows. So the Talmud's like, why do they call it Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah's cow? And it's because he didn't protest that the neighbor sent her cow out in the improper way on Shabbat. So it becomes called his cow. Well, it wasn't like he was out on the street with signs and noisemakers. Like, the point was that he just didn't go over to the neighbor's house and say, you shouldn't be doing that. And so
right,
this idea of protest is much richer than everybody should go out on the streets, especially when there's COVID and people are right to have the right to be worried about their own health, and to be worried about perhaps they might be part of a spreading further and they don't want to. There's all kinds of reasons, and you can make the argument either way. But I think that whether or not one goes out into the streets, there's also the question, right? Just going out into the streets isn't necessarily even enough, right? If you have the capacity to do more than that, right? If you're very, very wealthy and you go out on the streets, actually, maybe that was not the right thing for you to have done. Maybe you should have been donating a lot of money. That would be the more powerful thing for you to do. If you have a media enterprise, then really what you ought to be doing is making sure that your media enterprise is being used to send the right messages and to amplify the right voices. That's an area where actually I've been struggling this week, because I've really wanted to, I mean, not just this week, we've been wanting to give a platform to make Jewish Live and Judaism Unbound a place to amplify the voices of Jews of color and other Jews who are not fully welcomed, or don't feel fully welcomed into the Jewish world, to make it so that it's not only that we're talking to them, like, we actually want to say, like, this is a platform, please do things like, let's hear your Torah, let's do that. and
yeah,
and actually, for various reasons, it's been really difficult to make that happen. I think people are just like, they're exhausted, they're
they're
busy.
exhausted.
I mean, it's not because they don't want to do it. It's and yet, I'm kind of, and then I kind of feel guilty, like, but we're not doing it, we're not, but I'm trying, and so then it's like, okay, we keep trying, right? But in the same time, then I feel weird that here we are, two white Jews, and that's true on other shows that I'm on, and we may be marginalized for other reasons, in our case, because we're secular, because we don't really believe in God, that's actually put us out of. So there are ways in which, like, right, that's why I connect so much to the LGBTQ Jewish world, even though I'm straight, is because I feel like that world's Torah speaks to me, because I also feel on the outs, but
Yeah.
I also understand that I have tremendous privilege, both white privilege and like white Jewish privilege within the Jewish community. So it's not really the case. So so then I kind of like, well, what am I doing? Is it enough? Like, should we be having this conversation? But of course we should, because at the same time, the whole point is that white people should be having these conversations on their own, and that's what we're doing, and we're doing it sort of publicly. But if we weren't on the air, I would want to call you and process this with you, and that's exactly what white people should be doing, right? So it's
Yeah.
kind of it's a challenge. It's a challenge to, it's the biggest challenge is to stop the injustice in society, but the secondary challenge is like, what do I, what can I do best, right? That and most helpful in a time like this.
Right. Well, and I mean, I guess we all have a small sphere of influence. So I do think it's about keeping the conversation going, right? Right now, this is what people are talking about. And I think it's easy to kind of do the virtue signaling thing where you post a black square on your Instagram or whatever. But like, is this still a conversation you're having in 6 months? And I really believe, here we go, daring Judaism. Like, I'm going to say something that not everybody's going to like. It bothers me in our Jewish spaces. This is not exclusively Jewish spaces, lots of spaces, but let's talk about our Jewish spaces since that's what we're here to talk about. Where so many rabbis right now are posting statements about how they stand with Black Lives Matter and they believe in racial justice, and they're really great at saying the right words right now. But somehow never get to the point where they say, certain leaders you vote for uphold white supremacy, and you can make a difference, right? And when it comes to like which companies we support, where we divest our money from in our own institutions, we do have a lot of power, and that's always like the too political stuff. So I would rather we said nothing unless we were really willing to put our money where our mouth is. And what that looks like as a rabbi for me is I will address every instance of racism. And I've lost members last year when my community, secular synagogue, the online community, started doing, it was the Me and White Supremacy workbook by Layla Saad, which now is turned into a book, a published book called
It's
Me and
called
White
the mean white supremacy.
So
Handbook?
the book is called Me and White
Oh,
Supremacy.
me and white supremacy. I thought you said mean, and
No,
I was trying to
me.
understand. I thought all white supremacy is mean.
I mean, it is.
Yeah.
And it's also always about us, right? I
Right.
mean,
Right.
the book is a workbook to confront your own white supremacy. That's what it is. And a lot of people don't like to think of themselves as white supremacists, especially Jews who feel targeted by white supremacists. But it allowed for these really, I mean, it comes with these journaling exercises and like think about your childhood. And it was really powerful. We had amazing conversations in our community. And for the people of color in the community, I said, you can participate in this however you want. You don't have to go through the workbook, but we'd love to hear your perspective however you want. So it was for the people who are white to go through the exercises. But there was somebody who left the community and said, like, this is not what I signed up for when I joined a Jewish community. And I said, goodbye, like, that's fine. And then there have been other instances of, microaggressions, people who are not intending to be racist, but who make a racist mistake. And in those instances, I usually deal with it more privately. I sort of say something so the group knows it's being handled and say, like, I'm going to private message you. And then I do, and I try to foster conversations. But I really see it as my job to never let that go. And sadly, we did lose a Black community member this year because and as much as I feel like the majority of the community really cares about this issue and tries our best, she still felt like it wasn't fully safe for her. All it takes is that one mistake somebody makes, right? So we're still doing the work, and that is forever, right? This isn't about like you make your few Instagram posts and you move on.
Well,
and I want to see that more broadly.
Yeah. So so there's actually two separate, in a way, directions that I want to go, but so I want to mention them so that we make sure we go to the other one first.
Sure.
I mean, to go to the other one second, but I'm not sure which one we should talk about first. But one of them is like sort of what we were talking about last week and what you're just talking about now, which is kind of the failure of Jewish institutions and also of individual Jews. But I mean, to the extent that institutions have a role in the world, it's to help people do what they wouldn't do on their own. So yeah, I wish that people would just do things on their own, but the whole point, I think, of whether it's religion or any kind of wisdom tradition is the understanding that people are weak and fallible and don't always kind of really quite know what to do, or if they do know what to do, they don't have the get up and go to do it, and so we kind of have structures that help people do what they kind of know what they want to do. So therefore, I do point the finger at Jewish institutions to the extent that you can say that a lot of Jews, right, vote in ways overwhelmingly that are in line with anti-racism, let's say, right? I mean, like, meaning that they vote for one party over another that's more in line with that. You could sort of
Not
make that argument.
here, sadly.
Oh, interesting.
That's not true in Canada, but it is true in
Oh,
the US.
interesting. So, in the US, by the way, it's like less overwhelming than it used to be, or at least there's a subgroup within the Jewish world, namely Orthodox Jews, that don't vote overwhelmingly in that direction. So there's a lot to be said about it. But you might say that, the individuals, their heart is in the right place. Okay, that's step one. But if all that is that their heart is in the right place, and maybe they exercise that every 4 years or every 2 years at the ballot box, it's better than nothing, but it's not that much, and so the question then is like, well, what are we doing about it, and who, and so that's where I think that your j'accuse of the to the rabbis, and to the institutions, is to say, like, your job is actually to get the people to do stuff. They already actually believe the stuff, so you're preaching from the bima about the philosophy. First of all, maybe it's okay, maybe that's why they believe that stuff, that, so don't stop that. But
No.
if that's all you're doing, then actually you're not doing much, because they're not acting on it. And so that's a piece that I think we should talk about. The other piece, though, is that and this is the part that I think is the more daring Judaism part, that I want to say, is that I've been thinking a lot lately. I'm always thinking about this, like, next era of Judaism, and one of the issues in the current era of Judaism, the rabbinic era of Judaism, is that there's this question, and it's for Jews of color, but it's also for LGBTQ Jews and atheist Jews and all sorts of other kinds of Jews that don't fit the kind of expected way of a Jew being, according to the last 2,000 years. And they're trying to kind of get in. We're trying to get in a way. Like, we're trying to get accessibility, open, welcome, right? And sometimes it comes and sometimes it doesn't, and it should always be. And there's an absolute critique to make of those institutions, to the extent that they're not, in this case, fully welcoming of Jews of color, for example, or not, or, welcoming is even the wrong word, because it's not like welcome somebody, but it's about, like, you're part of this community. We can't, I said on Judaism Unbound this morning, I said, like, there is no we and you to Jews of color. Like, we are nothing without you, like, you are, we are you, that's how it has to be. Yes. And to the extent that it won't be, because those institutions are hard to change, like, that's part of why I really want this new Judaism, right? And I want a new Judaism that we white Jews, right, build together with Jews of color, together with LGBTQ Jews, trans Jews. I mean, I know it's part of LGBT, but particularly a particular group that's especially excluded. And so there couldn't be, if we're building it together, I mean, of course, there can always be internalized racism and everything, but assumedly, if we're building it together, then at least you're there from the beginning. You're a founder. So yes, we still have to make sure that we're not acting in racist ways, but you could less say that this is, like, kind of closed to people of color, because they built it. It's there,
Yeah.
and so what I but and with the daring part, though, is that I want to suggest that lineality of Jewish descent is the problem, meaning that I think that in the biblical era, Judaism was patrilineal. It went by your father. In the rabbinic era, until relatively recently, it was matrilineal, that your mother's identity defined whether or not you were Jew, and then you could convert. Um, but converts, and not all, but a large number of Jews of color themselves converted to Judaism, or their parents or grandparents did, so they can kind of have this sense of, when people are certainly look at them, and particularly, I mean, it depends how you define a Jew of color, but I mean, here I'm talking mostly about like African American Jews, that people kind of have the sense like they're kind of newcomers and they shouldn't have that sense and it's wrong and etc. But people do, and it's bad. And but what if we had a new definition of Judaism, of how one is a Jew, that has nothing to do with who your parents were? Meaning that if my parents were both Jewish, that doesn't mean that I'm Jewish. And that means that I can get out. It means that I can come in. But whether or not I'm a Jew is because I chose to be a Jew. And when we define Judaism that way, then a person who themselves converted, or a person who parents converted, or a person whose grandparents converted, are exactly the same as the person who has had Jewish ancestry for the last 3,000 years.
Yeah,
That, of course, that's how it's supposed to work in theory in terms of at least conversion, but it doesn't, because
no, it
there's
doesn't.
some sense that like but there's this whole like genetic lineal part that, it's not superior, but it's like a thing, we're a people, we've been together for thousands of years. And I would actually just like to break that. I'd like to say that that's not what Judaism is anymore. And if we are
Well,
that
that's my
radical, then
perspective.
yeah, but like then I think that potentially that means that we have to kind of, I don't know that it's quite a schism. It doesn't maybe have to be as stark as a schism, but at least it says that we are building a whole new network of institutions that's going to be built on that basis. And anybody who has a view of Judaism that's matrilineal, patrilineal, or in the case of like the Reform movement, matrilineal or patrilineal, we still don't really want to hang out with you, institutionally, because we want a Judaism that's nonlineal. That would be a daring new approach that I would advocate, and I think I have been advocating more and more strongly for.
Yeah, I mean, I would just maybe say it's not that new because in the movement of secular humanistic Judaism, that is our approach. We say you are a Jew if you identify with if your identity, identifies with the Jewish people, their history, their fate, their culture. That makes you a Jew. I don't care who your parents are or who your, whether you converted or not. And in fact, people often approach me about conversion, and I usually say, don't, why, like, don't convert, unless you have like a reason you need to convert for, moving to Israel or something. If you feel Jewish, you're already Jewish. If you want to do learning, it doesn't have to be called a conversion program. Some people do want something sort of ceremonial and ritual to be able to say that they've made a change, and I will support them through that. But absolutely, I am with you.
But I want to ask you, because I don't think it's as clear as like that this is the position of the humanistic movement, because my question is there such in secular humanistic Judaism, right? There's such a thing as a Jewish child, right? Like you say that a child is Jewish. I want a world in which there's no such thing as a Jewish child.
Right,
There's,
you're
in the
right.
same way that there's no such thing as a Republican child.
Right.
There's a child. A child is a child, and their parents are Republicans or Democrats or Jews, and maybe that's going to rub off on them. And then when they reach the age of majority and they can decide what they want to be, then maybe they'll decide to be a Jew. But they're not a Jew as a child, because that's not how Judaism works. Like
Yeah, interesting.
that's the world that I'm
You're
in.
right. Yeah, we're not there, but certainly in terms of adults being able to identify however we want, and also absolutely, there's this idea that a Jew can't leave Judaism. That is not true.
Right,
You
right.
can, and certainly that's one of the things that as I talk a lot about intermarriage, um, and it's one of the things that really bothers me is this idea that like the intermarried people are the not real Jews, when like you have so many people who are Jewish according to Jewish law and that they have a Jewish mother, but they do nothing Jewish. They don't call themselves Jewish. They don't want to be Jewish. Why is that person more Jewish than the person who is the child of intermarriage, but the wrong parent happens to be Jewish or whatever when they're participating, right? I definitely think the conversation needs to be shifted. It's an interesting thing about children because I do think there's something about instilling identity as being good for child development, like having a sense of your people in your community, not because of bloodline necessarily. Well, it doesn't have to be about that at all. No, I would think more about that,
Yeah,
but certainly, I've heard people say before, if you're Jewish, you're a Jew by choice
yeah,
because you're choosing to call yourself Jewish, and you don't have to in this world.
yeah. But I think that because the reason I want to push it is because I feel like until there's some really articulate and simple definition that kind of says, if you're if you're a Jew of color and you're not feeling fully part of this because the Jewish institution has not made you feel fully part of this, then leave that institution. Meaning, like, we you can fight the institution. I hope that people will, because I do want Jewish institutions to be fully open and welcoming. And so, like, I'm not saying that, don't fight that fight, but I guess I'm saying, like, I just I at least want to make sure that there would be an alternative that says, like, if you really want to be, a conservative Jew, and this is your local synagogue, and they kind of make you feel uncomfortable when you're an African American Jew that comes, and there's a security guard at the door, and they give you more of a hassle than they would to any white Jew that comes in. Like, yeah, you should fight that fight if you really want to be a conservative Jew, but I want to make sure that that maybe there's another option. Maybe there's an option that says, and it's not just an option that says to be a secular humanistic Jew, because maybe the person says, I'm not secular, I'm not
Yeah, of
humanistic,
course.
but it's like that there's like a movement of all of those dimensions of Jewish content that you might love, that says, hey, we want to sort of rebuild this in a new way in which you could not be excluded. And like, what would that world look like? I mean, I think it gets a
Mhm.
little complex, but it's another piece that I've been actually thinking about a lot since COVID, is that I- I've actually become much more interested in having fellow travelers who are more religiously observant or traditional than I would have said before COVID, because I
Hmm.
feel that COVID has I think COVID has been a destruction level event, and I think that whereas in the past you might have said that the issue with more observant folks is like they're never really going to change because innovation theory says that they won't, because like the happy customers kind of hold them back, and it's a whole big, theory of innovation. But once their main institutions are broken irreparably, then it's not so clear that there are any happy customers to hold them back. And so then I think there's a new openness to something new. And now I may be on the more radical end of that something new, but I think of the early rabbis and these mythic days of the Yavne, where the rabbinic Judaism was developed. There were like the more radical rabbis, and there were the more conservative rabbis, and the Talmud talks about their fights, but they can only have fights if they kind of let the conservatives into their sandbox, and they also let the radicals into their sandbox. So I'm intrigued by the idea that we could have a new sandbox that's not necessarily saying that it's all secular, but it's saying that there are certain truisms, certain sacred cows of rabbinic Judaism that we're getting rid of. And maybe at the end of the day, that'll be a bridge too far for the conservatives and they won't join, but if we say, for example, that lineality is not part of it anymore, but you can have, traditional praying if you want, maybe the
Yeah.
people who want traditional praying aren't going to end up being willing to sign on for that one, but I don't
Yeah,
know.
I mean, it's already moving in that direction. I mean, this is where I do think that, and this is true of Black Lives Matter right now, is that sometimes the outlier, people don't want to join them necessarily, but they do push the conversation. So, I mean, in the last few years, we do have conservative ordained rabbis who are pro intermarriage and who
Hmm.
are not in favor of, identifying Jewish people by the parent that is Jewish, right? And that is relatively new. And there's no question that's because of folks like me who were saying for a long time, like, what is going on? And
Right.
people more like them, conservative Jews, getting married by people like me because they had no choice, and then actually jumping ship, right? And so that's kind of how it works.
Right.
Um, it
It,
just reminds me, I feel like I just want to bring it back to Black Lives Matter for a second on
yeah.
that. Um, I know Tema Smith, who I happen to know from Toronto, um, and who built the tech for Secular Synagogue,
Hmm.
actually. um, but she's been quoted a lot and has pieces in the forward as a Jew of color, often, but also lately. And she wrote a piece that sort of said, like, so what's different this time? We've had race riots before, what's different? And I get where that comes from. It can be disheartening when you have the same conversation again and again. But what's new for me this time is the conversation about defunding police. I've
Mm.
never heard people who aren't Black say those words until very recently. And so it just seems like that element that gets called radical in Black Lives Matter, and it's like, how could you talk about defunding police? That would never happen. That now people are talking about it, right? And I see that Jewishly too. We do shift things for everybody. Not everybody will do it the same way, but the conversation is there.
Yeah, and I think that the interesting question is like, what do those avant-garde and radicals do at that point? Do they kind of say, "I told you so," or do they say, glad you're with us, glad to
Both.
see you here, I don't know, like, I don't know if like "I told you so" is ultimately helpful. I'm not sure. Like, I had a really interesting conversation years ago with a Catholic friend who was a canon law expert of Catholic canon law, and his particularly interest was marriage law. And in Catholicism, that if once you're married, you can't be divorced. It's not a policy. It's that the belief is that a sacred bond is actually like formed that literally cannot be broken. Like, there's nothing that's possible to break it. It's like
Yeah.
a physical thing, right? And so the only chance to get the equivalent of a divorce, is an annulment. But I think people think of an annulment as like some kind of like workaround to divorce, but which it might be functionally. But in theory, the point is that you've actually discovered that the marriage never really happened, so that bond was not actually formed. So then you can break apart the couple, because the bond, actually, the sacred physical, I'm not using the right word to describe that,
I know
they
what you
actually
mean.
believe that they can't break it, that even if
Yeah.
you wanted to, even if the Pope wanted to, it can't be
Yeah.
broken. It's
It's
too
not
strong,
possible.
right? So anyway, so this friend came, he's a brilliant man, and he came up with or he was pushing, I don't know if he came up with it, but he was pushing a concept that I think is called something like mistake as to the quality of a person. Meaning, like, what they have to do, it's kind of like contract laws. You have to find reasons why it was like a contract under duress, or it was like a contract that, where the parties were mistaken. And so it actually never really formed, and like, God knows that it didn't form. So he's saying, like, a mistake as to the quality of the person, meaning, like, it basically, like, I thought I was marrying, Joe, but it really was marrying Bill. It was actually a different person. And the evidence for that is that, Joe had an affair, and Joe would never have had an affair. So the person that I married was actually not Joe, it was functionally Bill. And so if I made a mistake as to the person that I married, then I didn't really actually marry that person, and then you could have an annulment. And this was like a new concept. It hadn't existed for 2,000 years of Catholicism. And I said to him, like, "Well, this is like genius." And it makes me feel really bad for the people for the last 2,000 years who were trapped in these like loveless marriages, because you hadn't been born yet to like come up with this
To come
great,
up with it. Right.
to realize that they were never married in the first place. And how tragic is that? Like, he didn't really appreciate that perspective. Like, I don't think I don't know if it fully registered with him, or he didn't like the idea. But like, somehow, but for me, it really stuck with me as saying, like, um that there's this stuff that it didn't have to be this way. And the radicals, I think, are the ones who are saying, like, it's like the emperor's new clothes. Like, they're saying, "Hey, God, it doesn't have to be this way." Like,
That's
or
right.
right. And they're just like, they're prophets, because they're seeing something sort of ahead of its time. And then something happens, whether a tragedy or some other reason, why all of a sudden people realize. And the prophet was right so long ago. And yet, if the name of the game is to make the world right, then it doesn't, then it is a tragedy that it didn't happen when the prophet first started prophesying. But it's good that it's happened now. So,
Right.
I don't know. I also, unfortunately, I'm not very sanguine that much is going to change. That's the other piece. Like, I don't really
I don't
believe
know.
that the police are going to be defunded, and that, any of this.
Yeah.
I don't really
Well,
believe. I mean, there'll be a nod to it, in the short term, but like, I don't really believe that it's going to happen, because I think that actually, and I'm not advocating for this. I'm not advocating for it, but I'm just being analytical about it. Like, I think, like, it has to be more of a revolution to get that kind of change.
well, I'm not sure. I mean, I'm a fan of the idea of revolution. Maybe this is a revolution. We don't know. I will say, I do think that there's the idea of change, in that like something explosive happens and then it's like radically different right away, and then there's also incremental change. Um, and I just I work at a small university called Trent University, and we this isn't actually what I was going to talk about regarding the university. I'll come to the other thing also. But a couple of years ago, I was asked to sit on a committee creating a new police foundations program. So interestingly, and I don't know how this works in the US at all, but we do have like police colleges basically, but very few of the actual police officers graduate from them. That it turns out that the ones who get hired have different kinds of experience a lot of the time. It's not required. And so at Trent, we wanted to create a social justice police training program. And so it has input from like sociologists, a really interesting professor whose work is in criminology and like really, really smart and socially just. Nursing, I represented education, Indigenous studies. It was a whole team of us. And we were like, what do police officers need to be able to be just police officers? And like, if that's your starting question when you build an education program, and we were like, these police officers would have backgrounds in social work. These police officers would have backgrounds in, and not just like I did a BS training session, like really, like this is their education, and they become police officers not because they want to be cops, but because they want to be social workers, and this is one way. And like that program exists now. I wrote a course for that program that I feel like is the most radical course any cop would ever take. I want every cop to have to take that course. I think people would self-select out of policing. They had to, you know what I mean? It would just turn so many of the bad kind of cops away. And that it's possible that will be a required program. It's possible that maybe if it's not fully defunded, it will be significantly defunded, and those programs will go to support social. True. And the police officers were part of that process, and they said, and these are like high ranking police officers, they said the majority of the calls we get are not for police, they're for social workers. The vast majority. You don't need a cop to go in. So why are the cops getting all that money? Like, we need better services, right? And even the cops know that. So I actually do think change is possible. Sadly, I think, unless we disarm police, there will still be, unfortunately, like the killing of Black and Indigenous folks. I think that won't change overnight, but I think we could make a vast difference. I really do. And I'm heartened to see that even more kind of mainstream people are having these conversations.
Do you have a take on what's going on with the police, in the sense that my wife and I were talking about it this morning, that like, when I was in law school, the definition of insanity is that if a police officer, but that if a police officer were standing right next to you and you would do the same crime, that's one of the ways to define insanity. And we were asking, like, after the eyes of the world are on the police because of the murder of George Floyd, and and everything that's happened in the last few years, and the eyes are on them right now, I mean, this week, and there's still all this brutality happening.
Yeah.
That they're almost like meeting the definition of insanity. And I don't say that to let them off the hook. I say that to ask the question of whether we actually have a so badly broken world of policing that it's actually insane in a certain way, and it's actually therefore it could be repairable in the way that somebody with criminal level insanity could still, in theory, be helped by psychology. But it's not just about like tweaking the system. It's about maybe something replacing it in some fashion. I mean, that maybe it's so broken.
100%.
It's so broken.
It's so broken. It's so broken.
And what is broken about it? Like, why is the police world seemingly devoid of ethics?
Well, there are many answers to that question, but certainly one of the answers to that question is that they do it because they can. Those cops out there right now who are destroying medical supplies and who are, doing photo ops where they kneel and then going and beating people in the streets and like all the stuff that we know is going on right now. Are there going to be consequences for those cops? I bet there aren't. So they know that. So they do it because they can, right? And they know they can. And that's step one. There's all these like police reform things going around. But if it was just clear, like, you will go to jail, we no longer protect our own. that would be a big difference, because I've seen cops do illegal things. Several years ago, I was part of a very long and bitter strike. Um, and we were having a permitted, peaceful march. And police officers came in completely unprovoked. I saw it and started, throwing people to the ground, like very violent, arresting people for no reason, charging them with assaulting police officers, all that stuff. It's not the first or the last time I've seen that from police officers. And I'm not a person of color, so I can only imagine, right, what they experience. And I went up to some of those cops, the ones not who were doing it, but who were standing there doing it. I said, "How are you? That's wrong. How are you just standing there watching this? It's wrong." And they kind of look like it's just, there is no way a police officer will police a police officer. And that
Right.
really has to
Right.
change. And if that can't change, like, I am kind of in favor of defunding the police. I'll just be frank.
Right. No, me too. But that doesn't mean, and I don't know. I mean, I'm not as deeply sort of inside of what defunding the police means exactly, like what replaces the police. I mean, I assume you need some kind of someone to keep the peace type of thing. So I don't know what that looks like exactly. I think I need to learn more about it, but but it seems right to me. Look, I mean, it's consistent with what I am saying about like Judaism, and like fundamentally, I think that sometimes institutions are so badly broken that it's better to start afresh, and you kind of take the best of the previous one, and you bring those parts over. I've been saying recently that I think the way I look at Judaism is the way that I think an engineer probably looks at most, electronics, which is that they say like, this is garbage. I could have done this much better, or like I see the components inside are really cool, but I could imagine something much cooler than what those guys did with it. So that doesn't mean that we don't look at the old version of Judaism and say it's not garbage. We say, oh, there's like 90% of it is great. Let's just leave behind the 10, or maybe it's 60%, but like let's leave behind the parts that are no good anymore, and let's kind of bury them in a respectful way, and then let's take the other parts and like make something really great out of it. So I think that maybe that's what we're saying about what defunding the police means, that we really just have to start over. And that doesn't mean that it's like anarchy in society. It means that we have to start over because the current system is too broken. And I think it's actually a little interesting. I mean, we'll see. It's interesting to have these conversations, and then like we're together again next week, and we'll see what happens. What I've been interested in
Mhm.
over the last couple of days is that in the U.S., where it seems that Donald Trump is trying to deploy the U.S. military to do various policing functions, and you're starting to get a pushback from the military commanders, at least retired ones, and I assume at least to some extent that the active duty ones are feeling in a similar way, and maybe may or may not be, but hopefully are guided by the speaking out of the retired military brass. And we even see the Secretary of Defense, who is not a person known for his backbone, saying that he's not willing to do certain things.
Yeah.
And it's interesting. It's interesting to see that because, first of all, like the military does terrible things outside of the U.S. for sure. There always has been, though, a principle that the military doesn't do policing, right? That the military doesn't have the power to arrest Americans, and the military doesn't do that. And it's interesting that it seems like that's an ethic that at least the senior military brass has absorbed to such an extent that when at this very late stage in the game, when they're pushed all the way to that point, that perhaps Donald Trump pushed it one step too far, and it's like kind of crossed a red line where they say like that we will not do. Now, I'm not particularly impressed with Jim Mattis speaking up only now when he had an opportunity to speak up, when Trump was on trial for impeachment. And I'm not really impressed with all the folks who kind of had an opportunity to actually do something that would be effective and didn't, and then months later are saying, this has gone too far, as if that wasn't predictable. But at the end of the day, it's also interesting to know whether various people, various players, do they have like no ethics, or it's just that they have very little ethics, but at a certain point you can push them too far, and that'll be kind of interesting to um to see how that plays out. I mean, I don't know if it like ends up being too little too late, or it's actually too late but like
Mm,
enough, at the end of the day it staved off the worst disaster. I don't know.
right. Don't know.
I don't know. Well, I feel like I never thought that there was going to be a way to um, like move the news cycle from a worldwide pandemic that is killing, so many people, and somehow that there could be something worse. But it seems that we have succeeded. So
But I do think, as we're saying, not just worse, but very connected, because the people
right,
dying of COVID-19, yes, are elderly, but the areas that have the most of it are the areas that have the highest density, often the most people of color, often the most poverty. I mean, certainly that's true where I live. They put in a map of like the kind of hotspots. And it tracks exactly, right?
right,
Where
right, right,
the people of
right,
color are, that's where there's COVID-19. That doesn't
right,
mean that's where it will stay. It can spread, but
right.
there are clearly social determinants of health. And if we care about health, not just for now, but for future pandemics too, like
Right.
those social problems are part of the solution.
Well, and racism is a pandemic that has been around for way longer than COVID and killed more people than
Much
COVID.
more
And
people.
it's maybe one positive of the confluence of the two things is that we can start to treat racism as the public health crisis that it is. And,
That's right.
you know, so just for the sake of that we do this on this show, and I think it's valuable to
It's a good
do.
one this week.
Yeah, we should turn to the weekly Torah portion that's traditionally read this week, and this week it's the second portion of the book of Numbers called Naso. Usually the Torah portion is named for the first word or the first major word in the portion. So anyway, but there's really kind of three things in this portion that I thought were really worth talking about. I'm not sure that we're going to have time to talk about all of them, but we'll talk. I know which one we will talk about. But the first one, and is the one that we really want to talk about, is this issue of the sotah, or the wayward woman, or the accused wayward woman,
Suspected adulteress.
suspected adulteress, and what happens to her. The second is this idea of the Nazarite, who is a kind of a Jewish monk, sort of, somebody who decides to live a life of uh, what's it called?
Asceticism.
Asceticism. Yes, asceticism, and and there's certain rules about how you should be if you decide to do that, and aspects of that. And then the third, that isn't really a story, but it's a remarkable thing just to know, is that the priestly blessing is in here. The blessing that the priests are supposed to give to the people. May God bless and keep you. May God I can't translate it on the fly, but yeah, may God shine in God's face upon you, right? That one. And um and if we have time, the thing that I was interested in talking about at that one a little bit is that I find that blessing so powerful, and yet I don't believe that God is doing any of those things. And I have this question about, like, do I have to not say that blessing? Like,
Ah,
right? Is there a way to rescue something like that? So anyway, but let's start with the sotah. Do you want
okay.
to tell a little bit about it?
Well, it's people should read it. I'm pretty sure it's Numbers 5. Um, the thing says, you if a man suspects his wife of adultery, there's this whole procedure they go through. I don't remember all the details, actually. I studied it so much, but
You like
the
write stuff on a parchment and then like
yeah,
burn
yeah,
it
wait,
or tear
we'll
it
come
up
to that.
and just
First, they
okay.
like drag her. Oop, I lost my mic. I got excited. I lost my mic over it. Okay, so yeah, so he's able to just accuse her publicly. They bring her in front of the priest. She's head uncovered, disrobed. And then there's essentially what we call a trial by ordeal. She's made to ingest this. Yeah, so there's like this incantation thing written, mixed in water with some dirt. She has to drink it. And then the idea is if she was guilty, then her belly will distend. Like there will be physical signs that she was guilty, and everyone will know. And if she was innocent, then nothing bad will happen to her, except obviously it doesn't say this in the text, but like me parenthetically saying, except all that bad stuff already just happened to her. And then I guess they go home and they're supposed to live happily ever after. Um, Interesting things to note, there's no parallel, like there's no way for a man to be suspected of adultery and for his wife to accuse him and for a similar process to happen. And also the text is very clear that this is only about suspicion, that there's no consequence to the man who accuses his wife and was wrong. Let's say that like we believe the trial by ordeal will be accurate, which we don't, and she's found to be innocent. Nothing bad happens to him for having, and he could simply do this because he wants to shame her. There's no consequence. So it's a much talked about and kind of fun to study one, because it's one of those where like this, like we think of, you know, Judaism as being kind of a system of justice, and like,
Right.
what is this doing here? It's fun to study. Anyway, I really want to hear what you think. It's not sexist. I feel like I know what you're going to say, so I want to see if
No,
I actually know what you're
it's
saying.
totally sexist in the big picture, meaning it's from a sexist society. The question is whether it's a little less sexist, meaning is it trying to be less sexist than it could have been. And so
Ah,
the first of all, by the way, I just want to note for folks what you just said about like you would think of Judaism as about justice and all these good things, and that, you know, I would assure everybody that doing the daily study of the daily page of Talmud, which my wife and I have been doing together for the last few months, like it's enough to relieve you of that assumption as well. Like
right.
there's so much, you know, I think of it as like junk DNA, you know, that there's like really like there's a lot of DNA, like we all have DNA, and like only a very small percent of it, I forget what it is, but like 2% or something is actually like the stuff that makes us human, you know, that gives us our traits, and the other 98% is just like there for like structural reasons, and it's like basically not important. Like you can't get rid of it because it's like part of the system, but like it's not really doing anything. And like I kind of feel that
I
way
like that analogy.
about the vast majority of the Talmud. I think there are other like ways to look at it, that it's more like a case book and it's just giving you these like hypotheticals, and they're actually intentionally like not really that important. But you know, anyway, it's my wife's response to it, because she's never studied Talmud before, is just like, this is Judaism, like this is so you know, petty and not, you know,
Yeah.
right. Anyway, the so on the sota, on the suspected adulteress, okay, so two things. One, I think this is probably what you think I was going to say, is that this unless you really believe in magic and you really believe that God is out there, and he's, and you know, this trial of by ordeal is actually going to, the whole point of a trial by ordeal is that God is deciding who wins
That's right.
the battle, right? You know, like it's when two people come with swords, you know, we've seen on Game of Thrones, you know, the idea is that you believe that God is going to determine the winner of the battle, and so you know that whoever died should have died. You know, that's kind of the idea of a trial by ordeal. If you have a trial by ordeal, like the way that they did for witches, for example, where they say like, we're going to burn her at the stake, and if she doesn't die, then you know, we would know that, I forget if we would know that she is a witch if she doesn't die, or that she's not a witch, or whatever. But the point is that you're actually like basically killing her. If what you're doing is
Yeah.
giving somebody like some really bad tasting water, then I almost feel like by definition, nothing's going to happen to them. Like their belly is not going to distend, and all the signs, like it's, I forget, it says like your belly will distend and your thighs will drop, or whatever that means. Like I don't think that's going to happen from drinking this stuff. So the question is, so one thought is like that this was intentionally a trial that would always come out in favor of the woman,
Mm,
meaning that it's a way of letting, it's a way of kind of like letting out the steam from this like suspicion that the husband has, but actually the woman will always be found innocent because the consequence will never happen. So it's kind of like a way within a sexist system, or you know, and you can imagine something analogous within like a racist system or whatever. It's like, well, it's too much, people wouldn't accept it if we said, you just have to let her, you suspect your wife, it's not enough, whatever. People would actually, they would end up killing the wife, let's say. But if we give them an opportunity to bring them to the priest, and then we do this trial by ordeal, and we know by definition she's going to end up innocent, then it's a way to get the husband to not kill the wife. So it's obviously, it's totally sexist, but it's trying to make the least bad thing happen. That's what
Ah,
I'm trying to suggest. That,
I like that reading. It's not my reading. I think that in some ways, I believe the opposite. I believe that the writers of this fully expected this to harm the woman. Um, and it was in no way designed to get her off the hook. It was designed to humiliate her and be a cautionary tale to others and be a kind of reification of male power. We can do this to you anytime, so be on your best behavior forever.
right.
Um, all of that. What is interesting is it seems like it was never actually practiced. So, and I wonder if it's almost the opposite of what you're saying, where they were like, well, this will never work. So this can't be the way we deal with this suspected adulteress, right?
Why? Where's the evidence that it wasn't ever practiced?
Good question. I don't remember why. It might be Talmudic where they talk about it, and it's one of those things like the stoning of a child, where it's clear like so many things have to happen. But maybe it was also historically investigated. I have to go back. I wrote a paper on this for rabbinical school, but that was so long ago now. I don't remember, but I do believe it's sort of consensus amongst rabbis that like this wasn't something that Jews actually did, although it is in our text. And so that also raises all those questions we've talked about before, like what even is this text? If this was something written as something supposed to happen procedurally and it never happened, like what's it for? So lots to say, but I do think, and people have pointed to the fact that it didn't happen as the not sexist thing. Like, look, they knew this was not something we could do to a woman, really. So I don't know.
Well, I do think that you're right about the humiliation of being dragged to this process in the first place, and that having all kinds of cautionary effects. Maybe it makes it less likely that you're going to commit adultery, but it also makes it less likely that you're going to do a lot of things that we today would want women to do. Meaning
talk back to your husband.
Right. It definitely keeps women in their place in an extremely sexist way. The question was really more just about whether the adultery actually ever ends up being found guilty. The other sort of related piece, though, is you talked about the question in the Talmud about stoning sort of a wayward son. Like the Torah says you should stone the prodigal son, or is it the prodigal? Anyway, the wayward ben soreru moreh, the sort of bad son. And the Talmud ends up saying like that that gives so many ways that you have to prove that the son deserves this, that basically it makes it undoable. So it makes it impossible. So one of the things that I heard recently somebody suggest about the sotah in this Torah portion is that actually maybe there's actually layers within the Torah, right? Because we believe that the different books and different parts of the Torah were written in different times, and then they were kind of layered on top of each other and edited together. And it was interesting. I hadn't really thought not only of this specific story, but about the Torah in general, that one of the sort of motivations of the editor could have been to do what the Talmud is doing to the Torah laws that it doesn't like, which is that it can't get rid of them totally because they're sort of accepted in society, but it can legislate them out of practice by making them too hard to fulfill. So maybe the sotah, like this idea of the dragging and the humiliation, was part of it, and like was an ancient thing and couldn't really be gotten rid of at that time. But they were able to layer on an extra layer about that having to do this particular trial by ordeal that they knew would always come out in favor of the woman. So that was like interesting. I don't know. I don't have evidence one way or the other. It doesn't, but I find it interesting, the idea that actually what I like about that perspective is that it says this wasn't an invention of the rabbis in the Talmud, that actually this was an ancient Jewish practice of not getting rid of things, but instead kind of like trying to do some tape and some glue and kind of like make it so it's not quite so bad. And I wonder whether and there's like a realism about human nature in that, and that maybe connects to what we were saying about the radical versus the, let's say, moderate reformer. The radical is, I think, an important voice, because the radical is who pushes the moderate reformer to be less moderate, but it may be at the end of the day that the moderate reformer is the person who says like, okay, I get it, I hear you radicals, I hear you conservatives, now my job is to kind of like try to stitch this together in a way that it can actually work. And I think that a revolution has to come when the work of the moderate reformers, it's too much, like they can't actually do that thing. And I would go back and say like that's where I suggest that both in terms of Judaism and also maybe in terms of our societies, that we're at a point more like that, you know, I'm not saying
Yeah.
that revolution has to be an armed rebellion, but where something more radical has to happen, led by the radicals, not necessarily led by the moderate reformers.
Amen.
So I guess we'll leave it there. I would like to go back maybe next week, maybe in a future time, to that question about like what we do with like a beautiful prayer that talks about God. And
I have so much to say about that.
Okay.
Remember, and then we'll talk about it first next week.
Okay, great. So we'll see you next
Okay.
week, Denise. I hope it's a better week.
Bye.